Hey everyone, welcome to Build. I'm your host, Brittany Jones Cooper. With all of the talking heads on TV news, it can be tough to decipher between truth and opinion. Soledad O'Brien, the award-winning journalist, author, and philanthropist who previously anchored and reported for NBC, MSNBC, and CNN, has found a way to cut through the noise. 5 years ago, she struck out on her own as the founder and CEO of Starfish Media Group, and now hosts the political magazine program Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien, which focuses on political and socioeconomic issues facing America. Everybody help me welcome Soledad O'Brien.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So, having this show now called Matter of Fact, are you saying something with the title, especially
This is our fourth year, though. So really, the idea that everybody would be talking about alt facts and no facts and fake facts really predate. You know, we were ahead of that. We just didn't realize, and I think it just turned out to be a good title for a show that was going to think about bringing more context to news coverage on Sunday mornings. We're syndicated, so we air mostly on Sunday mornings around the country. Some stations run us also on Saturday nights. And so the idea that you could really dig through facts and context to understand stories better. 4 years ago, that wasn't quite as revolutionary as it seems like it is now, but it really seems the timing has never been better for a show like that.
I'm sure it maybe felt like a rebellious act in some way where you're like, I want to cover the stories I want to cover, but now that's what people are craving because it's hard to cut through all the clutter on TV news.
Well, our show is a magazine show. We're pre-taped. Yeah. And what we found was what was problematic at first. Oh my God, the president tweeted last night. Oh my God, this bold-faced name says this. We can't really do that. And it forced us to say, well, what is the story? If all this crazy wasn't happening around us, what is the reporting we would just go do? And because we cannot respond to things, you know, in the second, and because we're syndicated, we usually sit between a show like Face the Nation or Meet the Press, because we're syndicated, we're on all the networks, and in different local markets, and then the local news. And they're doing, oh my gosh, the president tweeted, this is what happened. So we can avoid that. So the topics that we look at are, you know, so what is gerrymandering? People talk about their First Amendment right. What does that mean? Most recently, when someone takes the oath of office, what are they actually swearing to? Did you know there's a whole bunch of people who are Americans who've moved to Mexico because they can't afford rent in San Diego? So they're actually buying places in Mexico and then reverse commuting into the United States so that they can afford to live. I mean, there's so many interesting stories that are about context, and also we just don't let people scream at each other, which didn't used to be a big, like, notable thing, but now is a notable thing. And I think because of that, we've actually done really well in the show. The show's growing leaps and bounds. We beat every single thing on cable, which is pretty amazing for a relatively new show. And I think it's just, for people who want to understand what's happening in the world, it's a really good place to listen.
You talk about some of the topics. You guys cover politics, but also through the lens of education and health and science.
Which is politics, right? Politics. I know somehow we've gotten to this thing of like politics only takes place in Washington, D.C., and only bold-faced names who are screaming at each other actually are playing that game of politics. The rest of us are just living our lives. But our lives are impacted by things that are that are sort of decreed by policy, which is really where we get to politics. And so we definitely treat politics like how the government's decisions and how voters do things that impact us in our daily lives. Oh, I hate to say it, I don't want a lot of bold-faced names. Like, I'm not broken up when Paul Ryan does not want to come on my show. I don't care, because I want to speak to a person who is dealing with the impact of a policy versus someone who I know is going to spin, and I don't just mean Paul Ryan, I mean, pick the person on the Democratic side, who's going to spin to me about what, all the work they're doing in Washington, D.C. It's much more about lives that are being lived and how policy is affecting people. Last weekend, we took a look at Title I schools, right, which is, Title I was created to make sure that poor students also we're getting more funding from the federal government to help them, help underwrite the things that they did not have. But it turns out there's actually a lot of wealthy schools that have a few poor students that get a lot of federal funding for their poor students, but they're in they're wealthy, successful schools. So it's kind of not the mission of what Title I was all about. Why is that? How do you stop that? I think people don't know those things, and I don't need a politician to come on and sell me on something. I really want to talk to researchers who can dig into the information.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's what's so appealing to me is that when I watch news, I get really confused and I don't know how it relates to my life.
But when I want to start smoking and drinking. I literally I should make myself a martini and just like watch a TV show. Watch
After
TV
I watch
news.
a roundtable, I'm like, where's the tequila? I cannot actually go through my daily
shots,
life.
everybody shots.
Yeah. So your show will take something like AI. We hear all this stuff going on about AI, and it shows this one researcher who found that facial recognition actually has a bias, that it won't recognize black faces in the same way. And then you can look at how that relates to policy and things that need to be tightened, and it feels so much more tangible to me than just watching people talk. Yeah.
A little more solution oriented, right? Because she talked about how she started reaching out to all the tech companies to say to them, when I try to do an art project and put myself through your technology, I don't exist because it can't read my black face. And her white friends would sit down. They'd be like, no, this thing works great. She's like, no, it does not. And so the idea that she reached out to IBM, who then changed their technology because she had raised it for them. She's a really incredible young woman at MIT. So there are solutions and there are strategies. And that doesn't mean that AI is not biased. Obviously, human beings use data sets that are created by human beings, and human beings are biased, so it's not exactly a shock. But I think it gives some context to not only is that true, but what's being done about it.
The midterms are coming up. So
what? Really?
Yeah.
What?
Little midterms, no big deal. So how will that change how you guys approach coverage, or will it?
Again, I don't think it will really change for us anything in a big way, because the midterms are about what is resonating with a voter? How do voters feel about their finances? Not someone crowing about some legislation they got passed. Like, how do you feel about it? What is the impact of that said legislation? Occasionally, we do have elected officials on because I'm always very interested when Democrats and Republicans can work together and what those projects are. And occasionally, there are some things that have been very successful that are bipartisan because, as you know, it's such a divided and divisive time in Washington, D.C. But I don't think it'll change. We'll continue to go around the country. When you're syndicated, you basically are in a number of markets. And so in a way, you pop into these markets and find out, what do people here care about? One thing that was so remarkable to me was to see that in a lot of rural communities, their issues with hospitals were exactly the same as the urban communities, right? People like to say, well, the white people over here in Tennessee and Ohio are nothing like the black and brown people over here. That's not really true. When you actually talk about hospitals and specific things and you kind of ignore the legislators, you actually see their issues are very, very similar, which makes you think, well, maybe there's a way then that people could come together around the issues where they impact them the same.
I think people sometimes forget that even though I've lived one lifestyle, I do care about how other people are living, and you're looking for ways to connect. And I feel like you were saying, so often we're told that it's separate and you don't understand, but you've shown throughout your career with Black in America, Latino in America, that we all are really connected. And I think we care about other people's existence.
Sometimes television executives, I think, really discount the American public. Certainly, watch TV a lot, and you'll be able to say that. But so you have, for example, when we did our first Black in America documentary series, I mean, people at CNN who were funding the series were really concerned, right? Like, because the CNN audience is a white audience. In fact, one executive said to me, don't make it too black. I'm like, and by then I'd just been around long enough to be like, okay, like, what does that even mean? But they're very worried. And I think understandably, right? They were so worried this thing called Black in America would push away the audience that they really thought was valuable, which was the white audience. And what ended up happening, of course, was that was one of the most viewed documentaries that CNN ever did. And we grew our Black audience tremendously. But we grew our white audience too, because it was just good, interesting storytelling. We actually got in a fight when we did a documentary called Women of Ground Zero. It was on an anniversary of 9/11. And we told the story of 6 rescue workers at Ground Zero on that day. And people would literally fight with me. Like, what are you saying? So women are more brave than men? I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, that doesn't even make sense. And finally, I actually would win that argument because I would say, do you know how many stories on German Shepherds I've done of 9/11? Like, we can do an hour on women rescue workers. By the way, lots of men in that story because some of the women were married and had men who were telling their point of view. And also, it was just a dynamic and interesting story. And then when you win, and you win in ratings or you win in just how, people feel about the story, you can sort of say, see, we're not just trying to cherry pick the women. We're trying to do good storytelling, and everybody's interested in someone's point of view. That might not be their own personal experience, but they can relate to it.
One of my favorite things about you, Soledad, is your Twitter.
My Twitter is seriously amazing.
Your Twitter is fierce.
It's pretty good.
I love, coming up in media, you used to not really get to know the people in front of the camera. They had to be very one-dimensional. And what I love now is that I actually get to see people's personalities and thoughts and opinions in their lives. And you've done the best job on that, where you're not forcing out your opinion. You're more aggregating interesting things that you've read and bringing it to people and sort of opening people's eyes to different
And then I have a picture of a cat and a picture of a horse and a picture of a child.
So,
and me and my hair.
How important is it for you to really utilize Twitter and social media in that way?
I never realized that Twitter would be a very important tool for us in our business when I started the company. I just like being on Twitter. And then when you're not working for a big corporation, and really I follow our social media rules that I made up, so I follow them to the T. A lot of people can't because their company, their big corporate entity says, you can't do this, you can't do this. And sometimes the risks are so high, like why would you? I don't really have, I follow my own social media guidelines that we have. But I really found that when you have a voice, it is very interesting the kind of business opportunities you can get. So we've actually been hired out to do a number of documentaries just from relationships on Twitter, and interesting documentaries. So for example, we've been asked, and this will air on our show as well, to look at, could you, in Louisville, Kentucky, can you bring in resources to an impoverished community? They're building this big facility, $30 million investment, and not gentrify, like not kick everybody who's there out, right? Because this is the big problem in America. It's like, the great news is they put up a wonderful facility, and the bad news is all the poor people, because they didn't have high home ownership in the community, developers came in and basically kicked them out. That's kind of like Story of America Part 7. So we're going to look and follow that story as they put this new facility in, because the mayor actually there is very interested in, can you intentionally go into a community and not kick everybody out, but actually raise it for everybody? I don't know the answer to that, but things like that are conversations that really started on Twitter. And I think, and there's a handful more where those are business deals that came about because I think people were like, wow, you have some interesting thoughts on this. Here's something we're struggling with. Do you think we could have a conversation?
Speaking of things trending on Twitter, obviously the Me Too movement has really transformed the entertainment industry, and media specifically has been under a really small microscope since all these stories started coming out. How do you think that the Me Too movement has affected the media industry?
Listen, I think the media industry is just a stand-in for every industry. In some ways, it's just a little more salacious because people know the people, right? If you mention some random company and some random, second-tier manager and say, oh my gosh, Bob Smith, no one would care. So to some degree, I think there's this brighter spotlight because people know the person. They're publicly famous. But I think the issues are all the same. And I'm not sure we've really figured out a vocabulary for having these conversations. I remember Matt Damon was kind of pilloried when he said he thought that there was this spectrum. And everyone's like, no, you can't say that. And men have no voice in this conversation. And I agree with him. I think there is a spectrum. In fact, the law would agree with that. And also, I think everybody has to have a voice in it. Like, what if you have a bunch of just women only in a conversation? I don't think that really gets to the entire country. I think you need everybody trying to grapple with these issues. And I think you have to have a really thoughtful conversation. Listen, I've worked in newsrooms where I've had people who love to hug, and I don't want to be hugged by them. And not even, I don't want to hug people. I love hugging. I don't want to be hugged by them. Like, I do not want you to touch me, period. And I do think that's different than somebody who's rubbing up against you and being just disgusting. And that's different than someone pinning you down and sexually assault. Right? I believe there is this sort of spectrum. So how do you have a conversation about all of these things that have happened, we know, in the media? And I think everybody's voice really does need to be around the table. And maybe that's not popular, but one of the fun things about running your own company is you get to say and do whatever you want. Like, okay, you can love me, you can not love me, I don't care.
I just feel like media has really taken a hit after Trump was elected with credibility and people being able to trust it. And then when we see these high-profile people like a Matt Lauer or a Les Moonves sort of getting taken down, do you think that damages media at all, or you think it's just a separate thing?
You know, I mean, of course, it's always that issue of anytime there's a bad actor in a group, right? Wherever it is, it's bad. I think police officers would tell you the same thing, right? You can be an amazing police officer for 20 years, and if there's someone terrible in your organization, everyone's going to say this is a terrible organization, and sometimes a little bit justifiably. So I do think that the credibility issue for media has fed into that a little bit over time, right? So if you're going to run at things like entertainment, you're going to run the risk of people saying, you know, you're giving opinion. I think that is problematic if you don't make it really clear. I think that that's a little bit different than the credibility issue around some of these bad actors. But you go to go to any factory and you take 10 women and say, so, you know, who are the bad actors? They'll name them, and they'll all name the same people because it's about power, right? It's about the opportunity to be able to do that. When I started working in TV news, I worked with a woman who was an editor, and she would talk about being groped I was 23 years old. She would talk about just being groped all the time because as an editor, you know, she'd sit at a desk and people would come up behind her. I mean, and she wasn't a powerful person. So it's not just media, obviously, and never to say that the media shouldn't be blamed for what the media does wrong. But I mean, I think it's just an indicator that every single industry has a big freaking problem.
On matter of fact, you've had a lot of really interesting guests, but for you, who is somebody that you really want to sit down with on your show?
You know, I really have always enjoyed just regular people who are dealing with something. I love talking to local secretaries of state because they're the ones who actually have to deliver something, right? They don't have to stick in these partisan talking points. They actually are dealing with people in their community. So in some place, you know, if you're the mayor, you better fill the potholes because if everyone's mad about the potholes, you will not be reelected. So they tend to be more honest and they tend to have to serve their real constituents, and their constituents are everybody, right? They're not like, I speak for the Democrats only or I speak for Republicans only. They got to fill the potholes or they won't be reelected. And that's kind of the people that I'm much more interested in talking about. And I think it's also where you get to the contradictions and the complications, and you know that government is messy and things get messed up, and sometimes things happen unintentionally as well. And so I think local people who are dealing with these things really are the best spokespeople. So our goal is always to just give more context to people so that they can understand what the conversation is all about.
In a lot of ways, they're also the future of politics. I think you just interviewed Mayor Garcetti.
Yeah.
Of LA, and he's a mayor, but there's rumors that he might want to run for a larger office.
And he'll tell you that he might. Like one thing that was so refreshing, because the number of here's how it goes. So, sir, you've been making the rounds in Iowa. You want to run for president? No. Oh, what? No. You know, and you're like, so I'm playing my role and they're playing their role. And he's like, yeah, I think so. Right. Gonna look into it. I'm like, wow. Oh my gosh. Are you actually saying that this is something you're considering? Yeah, that was a little bit refreshing. I find the mayor of New Orleans, the former mayor of New Orleans, I haven't had a chance to sit down with the current mayor of New Orleans. He was always very blunt. I remember once asking him, he's a Democrat, and I remember asking him, so if there was someone like the Koch brothers who were very hardcore right, who were offering you money to deal with the opioid crisis, would you take that money? He said, I need to be clear. Well, he said it with a New Orleans accent, which I can't do. I would crawl over broken glass to get that money, right? Like mayors do not screw around.
Money is money.
And I think, and the opioid problem is such an entrenched problem that he's willing to do anything to kind of solve it. And you never get that answer from Congress members, and you know, it just becomes much more political. So you don't feel like you're really getting a truthful answer often.
Absolutely. So you've been doing the Starfish Media Company for 5 years. What is the biggest thing you've learned? I'm sure there's been a lot of trial and error.
There's a thing called quarterly taxes.
Ooh.
That's what I've learned. And you probably should pay them. Our first year, someone's like, so your quarterly taxes? I'm like, what's quarterly taxes? I had never run anything. And so the answer to that is really hire a really good finance person because they will save your butt. You know, I think the really most important thing I learned, and having worked in television for about 25 years, was there was a lot of other stuff I was good at. Like, I negotiate deals really well, and I would not have said that that would be a strength. When you run a company, you have to just be solution oriented, right? Someone might say, I want to do this, but I need everything to be pink. And you're like, we can do that. Let's figure it out. I'm not sure how, but yeah, we can do that. And you're constantly thinking of solutions. And so I really discovered that I'm actually a good negotiator, that I can help people get to a solution and figure out what they're trying to do and help solve those problems. And that's been fascinating. Very rare that, I'll be 52 on Wednesday. And you really get to sort of learn something about yourself. I can read off a teleprompter. I love reporting. I love being in the field. I'm a good anchor. I do great interviews. All those things I feel very confident about. But the other stuff that I wasn't so confident about, to realize that some of it you're really good at, was great. And then to recognize, like, somebody else should do this. I should not be doing that. We will hire a person to handle this part of it. But it's been really fun. It's been a really, really great experience.
I think that's really important for women to hear from you. Like, I have discovered I'm really good at other things, and I feel like that can stop a lot of people, but to see the success that you've been able to find is, I think, really inspiring.
It takes a lot of time, I mean, if you remember back to your first job when you were 20, like you walked in the door and you didn't know where the bathroom was, and you're kind of like, I think the bathroom's that way, and you're walking around, and you also don't have enough to do, so you're kind of standing around waiting for someone to, it's so awkward, right? It's kind of how I felt like for the first 6 months, year of owning this and running a company was, every day was a learning experience. And I was like, God, can we just have a day where I didn't learn anything? Can I just have a day where we just execute and do stuff? And it took about a year before I really felt like we are now running. And we were lucky. We were profitable immediately because CNN came in as my first client, actually. And so that was great. But even in that, I didn't really think about some of the deals that we were doing. If you make them start immediately, right? You sign the contract and the deal starts, then the clock is ticking, and you don't have an office. You have your dining room table with all your stuff on it, right? So just learning those things about how to run a business was a great experience, and then sometimes just incredibly stressful. But after a year, you sort of get it.
I'll read that book if you write it, okay? Yeah. Let's go to the audience really quick before we get out of here.
Hi. So as a seasoned reporter and journalist,
I love seasoned instead of old. Thank you.
I'm just wondering about the current state of journalism and reporting. How has your approach to reporting changed or not changed within the last few years?
I love reporting, and I worry that we don't see enough of it. Because if you think about it, those big panel shows are just cheap to do. Right, each of those people is paid like $100,000 to $150,000 to be a contributor. And then they're on every single show. They kind of churn through. It used to be we would start with a piece, a 4-minute piece that would set up the discussion. Now they don't even do that, right? It's just we get right into it and they start fighting. There's no sense of context. What we've done really well, I think, on Matter of Fact, is it's just really all about context. And so we do a fair amount of reporting in the field where we will literally go and sit in with people and find out, for farmers, how is it going here? For police officers, what's their experience that they're dealing with? Just trying to see where somebody is. The opioid crisis was a good example where we kind of camp out in different communities. So reporting is everything, right? That's to me, it's everything. And so when you sort of cheapen it and diminish it by just having these panels after panels, I get it. Financially, it's a very smart decision, right? Because it's just cheap, and you can do an entire show and never have to do a live shot and never have to pay. It's expensive to send somebody in the field. It's expensive to have a tape and a tape editor and a writer and a producer. Like, that costs a lot of money. But I think you really ruin the product and you lose the context of what you're trying to talk about. So we still do a lot of reporting. I wish more people did.
I'm with you. It's journalism 101. It's what they teach you in school, and it's gone now. And I think that's why I like Matter of Fact so much, is that it feels stabilizing to me. Like, you can know the full story and have context, and you're not just walking out like with somebody else's opinion. You can form your own opinion.
Yeah, the screaming also. When you watch a lot of screaming on TV, it's really stressful. I mean, and I'm pretty imperious to stress, but watching people scream at each other freaks me out.
And one more question.
Hi. So I'm wondering, what advice do you have to aspiring and up-and-coming journalists in this new age and political climate?
The new age and the new political climate, to some degree, you're not responsible. Meaning, often I hear people saying, like, well, what should my mission be? You're trying to learn how to be a new journalist? Then just go back to the fundamentals. no journalist today is only doing one thing. And when I started, people were like, oh, I don't do live shots. I only do this. Or I'm just print. Oh, I only do magazine reports. That doesn't exist anymore. So my advice would be you're going to be across every single platform. So make sure you're good on all those platforms. Anybody who's in print and is not doing some kind of a show every single day, even if their mom and dad are the only people watching, you should have your little camera set up and you should be reporting. It's great practice to do 100 shows and see, do I like the way they sound? Do I like what I'm writing? Do I like, what's my point of view? What's my voice? All of those things are so, so critical. And you can do that with your iPhone today. You don't necessarily need to, as I did, talk somebody into giving you a video camera. So think about being across every single platform, writing constantly, being on camera constantly, and really thinking about, what your voice is and what are the stories that you want to tell.
Thanks.
That's great advice. I also think reading. I feel like people don't read anymore. It's so important, like to actually read different opinions and not just read one newspaper, but read as many as you can get your hands on.
Well, my husband likes to talk about how he was reading a book in the car because someone's reading it to him in the car. I'm like, I guess that sort of counts, kind of.
Right.
Kind of.
Well, Soledad, I could talk to you all day, but I'm going to let you go run this amazing company. Matter of fact, please tell people where they can watch it, because I know it's sort of different for wherever
Because
you
we're
live.
syndicated, it really depends on the market that you're in. But if you go to matteroffact.tv/on TV, and I post it on Twitter all the time, or just Google where is Matter of Fact air. You can find it, and you can just check your local listings for when we come on. Usually, most places Saturday nights or Sunday mornings across the country.
And of course, all the videos are available online. I know because I've watched all of them, and I
tweet them.
encourage you to too. Everyone, put your hands together for Soledad O'Brien.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.